Hi everyone, this is Ricky Spencer and welcome to another of our series Voices for the Sociology of Media. Today we have as our special guest Professor Barry Judd. Barry commenced in the position of Professor and Director of Indigenous Studies at the University of Melbourne in February 2020. Prior to this, Barry was based at Charles Darwin University in Alice Springs. Barry is committed to the research of issues that impact Aboriginal peoples who lived in the arid inlands. Barry is part of the Central Australian Research Group and his substantial position is Professor of Indigenous Social Research. Barry acted as Pro-Vice-Chancellor for Indigenous Leadership for CDU from June to December 2018. Barry has worked in higher education since 1989. He commenced employment at the University of Melbourne as an Aboriginal cadet, as a member of the administrative team back in January 1990. Barry Judd is a descendant of the Pitjantjatjara people of northwest South Australia, British immigrants and Afghan cameleers. He is a leading Australian scholar on the subject of Aboriginal participation in Australian sports. Barry's main research interest is in issues around identity. What kind of Australian identities have been formed out of the colonial contact between Aboriginal and non-Aboriginal peoples in Australia? His research focuses on Aboriginal people in sport as a way of engaging for broader population in difficult questions around the place of Indigenous people in Australian society. Barry is a well-published author in the area of sports history and the field of Australian Indigenous studies, and has held several research grants funded by the Australian Research Council. Welcome, Barry Judd, if I may call you that, on our wonderful series. So tell us a little bit about what got you to where you are today.
That's a really good and difficult question to answer, but I guess, Ricky, the thing that always sticks out in my memory as a young child engaging with education at primary school level was an incident where, not quite sure what grade level it was, maybe grade 3, maybe grade 2, but the teacher was rolling out the the stock standard version of Australian history and referencing the Captain Cook story and the discovery of this continent in 1770. And I put my hand up and said, wow, well, my mum and her family are Aboriginal, and they've been here way longer than, when Captain Cook decided to turn up. And I was kind of made to feel like that was an inappropriate question or comment to make. And I was sent out of the classroom and disciplined for doing that at the time. So I think that's a memory that's kind of stayed with me all these years and has really shaped the rest of my life to some extent, because consciously or unconsciously, I think it's directed me and made me want to make a contribution to education in ways where that kind of thing no longer happens. So, it was the start of a journey for me, a journey into knowing what it meant to be to have an Aboriginal heritage and affiliation, and a journey into how race relations operate in contemporary Australia and what that means for both settlers and Indigenous people.
Mm. And Barry, what was it like for you in your high school years?
High school years, again, interesting. I grew up in Ballarat in central Western Victoria. And Ballarat, for people who don't know, is a place with a fairly significant history of engagement with Aboriginal people. It was one of those focal points for the stolen generations. It had an orphanage. A lot of Aboriginal people went through that place. It also is a place with a history of denial of traditional owners, so Wathaurong or Wadawurrung people. But at the same time, it's also a place, because of those things, that always had a strong Aboriginal community, and the Ballarat and District Co-op was always a focal point for activity. So my high school experience was shaped by those things, that kind of context. And while there was a strong denial that Aboriginal people existed in Ballarat, there was also points of time where it was obvious. And I remember the Koori education workers, or whatever they were called, coming out on a regular basis to our school, and there'd be these announcements over the PA, would such and such, the following students, please attend this office. So on the one hand, there was a denial of identity. On the other hand, you were made to feel different because of it. And I guess those things have shaped my experience. Being a fair-skinned person, of course, makes identity ambivalent in many ways. And you get to be part of, I guess, both Indigenous circles and non-Indigenous circles, because you can kind of weave your way through those things. So when people think of racism, they generally think of it in terms of someone's physical appearance. If you've got brown skin, if you have a classical Aboriginal nose, you're going to be more of a target for racism. And while I think that's probably true, what's less well recognised is the kind of racist experience that fair-skinned Indigenous people experience, because you're privy to social situations and conversations with people that brown-skinned Indigenous people would never, ever hear about. So, you end up hearing a whole lot of racist stuff that people spout simply because you don't look Aboriginal.
Did you find sometimes in that space you had to almost validate your own Indigenousness to sometimes within mob?
Not so much. I think one of the strengths of Indigenous Australia is its generosity towards people and its ability to accommodate all sorts of identity positions. Having affiliations with people up in Central Australia, it was never an issue. If you related to someone through kin networks, it doesn't matter what you look like. Down in Victoria, of course, we don't have those things to fall back on. I think my experience is that the folks down here put me through a period of apprenticeship where they, let's see how this fella goes. Is he someone we can trust? And when I say period of apprenticeship, I'm probably talking about 15 or 20 years, where you engage with the community down here and you become known, at least in some circles, as a decent person who can have your confidence. So I think that's what happens. And it's really about, from my point of view, Indigenous people and communities, wherever they are in Australia, not judging people by physical and biological and racial frameworks, but by judging them on relationality and on knowledge and ethics. So, I think that's not to say that some of our mob don't get caught up in framing things according to race. Of course they do. After 2 centuries of having that forced on them, it's going to happen. But I think broadly speaking, and my experience has been that Indigenous people frame things differently and they don't really care what you look like. As long as you've got relationships, and where those have been somewhat severed or made difficult because of things like stolen generation, there are always people in the community that are willing to work and find those connections that have been buried.
And tell me about your love of sport. When did that start?
Really started by accident. I'm not a sports person myself, apart from playing footy at school and a bit of country cricket into my early 20s. So I never wanted to or thought I would become known for writing about sport. Years ago, I did a Masters of Public Policy at Melbourne, and before that, a graduate diploma of Public Policy. And at that time, I had this crazy idea that if you're an Aboriginal person and if you had qualifications in public policy and such, you might be able to get a job with a state department like Aboriginal Affairs Victoria. It didn't work out that way. I could never secure that kind of job in the public service. So I decided that I needed to do a PhD, and I started a PhD at Swinburne, which was looking into the history of Indigenous education policy. So I wanted to, I think Leanne Holt's done this in recent years, but I had this idea of going back to the 1950s and 60s and writing a history of the development of Indigenous people, starting to put together frameworks, agendas and policies around what would become known as Indigenous education. I got about 2 years into that. The Howard government was in power at that time, and I wanted to access all these files that were put together by an Aboriginal Secretariat of Education that existed back in the 70s. And they said, we're happy for you to access that stuff, but we're going to have one of our lawyers read through these documents page by page by page, and it's going to cost you about 40 grand to access it. I went and spoke to my supervisors, and they said, look, this is a great project and a great idea, but you're not going to be able to come up with that kind of money. You need to think of another PhD research topic. So it just happened that at the time around Swinburne Uni, at that time I was working there as well as studying. Sid Jackson, who was a football legend, played for Carlton in a couple of premierships in the 1970s, had come over to the Victorian Football League as a member of the Stolen Generation from WA. Sid was doing some work at Swinburne, and I think he must have been in his 50s at that time, and said, I don't know much about my background as a Stolen Generations person. I don't know anybody in higher education who could help me put together the story. So he said, I know you, can you help me? And he got some money out of the Carlton Footy Club. And we did a couple of trips back around the year 2000, back to Western Australia, where we literally sought out his family out in the desert, and up at Port Hedland, and then down in Perth. We did this massive couple of road trips. We were able to access his Native Affairs files, as they were called, and try and piece together what his life was like when he was a 2-year-old, a 3-year-old, and a 4-year-old. And these people were trying to steal him away from his mother and his siblings. So, you know, I started off doing that work around that, and then I realised through that work how sport can open up these opportunities for Aboriginal people. No matter where we went in WA, people recognised him, even though he hadn't played footy there since the 1960s. And even though he's a very classical looking Aboriginal man, there was no racism from the public in WA, which I thought, wow, this is amazing. People love him. And the reaction on the street was, are you Sid Jackson? Like, can I have your autograph? Or you were the best player I ever saw. Or sometimes if we're in a pub, people would come up and say, can I come and have a drink with you and buy you around? So out of that experience, I put together a PhD about Aussie rules football and Indigenous participation. And it kind of spilled into the whole question about whether Aussie rules as a sport has Indigenous origins, because of this game called Man Grook, which was played across Victoria. So I got into that, and the rest is history. I've been writing about sport and Aboriginal participation ever since. It took me up to Central Australia to work on remote community footy issues. And just a couple of weeks ago, I spent the day at the MCG with Sid again. And he's in his 70s now, I believe. And he wants... out of that work came a book for me, so a PhD in a book, and there's a chapter on Sid if anybody's interested to read it. But catching up with him again recently, he wants more work to be done on his life story, which is, you know, I'm honoured that he's still my friend over 20 years, and I'm a researcher. That doesn't happen very often, I don't think. So that's my story of doing sports research.
That's incredible. And I just want to now take you a bit forward to 2021 and the recent, I was just thinking as you were speaking about Eddie Betts retiring. How has that sort of, we've heard so much about how his wonderful work on the playing field, and how many young Indigenous young boys growing up, and girls, we should say too, who look up to him, and his recent statement he made about feeling unsafe. Does that sort of, when you hear comments like that, how does that sort of make you feel?
Well, sad. On the other hand, it vindicates the work I've been doing since I started working with Sid back 20 years ago or so. There's a lot of people out there who make ridiculous claims about racism no longer being a factor in the AFL or Australian sport. And the truth is that it continues to shape the experience of Indigenous people, of people from immigrant backgrounds. If you move beyond the race frame to discrimination more generally, there's a lot of gender discrimination around that. And those things exist at the elite level, but I think more attention needs to be paid to community level sporting bodies who often have less of an idea of how to deal with these issues properly than the AFL. So there's a long way to go. How do we change things and move forward? Well, I always think that a good way of addressing these kind of issues is to look at the boardrooms of sporting bodies or sporting clubs and say, no wonder we've got a problem, because it's just a bunch of privileged white guys sitting around a table making decisions. I think the way you address this in the AFL is to get, diverse people into the board, and to enable a situation where you make decisions based on the experience and expertise of those people. Instead of what we've got now is a situation where you've got people like Gil McLaughlin inside the institution and people like Eddie Maguire in the media running the narrative on these things. And they're pretty clueless. They haven't experienced situations where they're marginal. They're not women, they're not trans, they're not Indigenous, they're not people from African backgrounds who come here traumatised. They're none of those things. And for me, that's the problem we need to address.
And I was thinking, just as you were speaking, I would hope one day that we would have like an Indigenous player who comes out as LGBTIQ. Do you think that will, because I know that would make such a wonderful difference in my area of research and with young queer Indigenous folk, that they can have that role model. Can you see a day when that could take place, Barry?
I can see a day. I think that person will have to be extremely brave and have exceptional leadership qualities. But I can see a day, it wasn't too long ago that we could never, or most people couldn't imagine a women's football league operating. That's happened. Some people have come out and spoken about their sexuality, I think, certainly in rugby league, and I believe in the AFL as well. And at lower levels, there's been some discussion about the position of trans players in football. Unimaginable that we'd even be having the conversations 20 years ago, but they're happening now. So I think there's probably been more significant change at the player level. Players today probably get these things on the balance better than the administrators. And I really think that it's the governance of sport that needs to change and hasn't kept up with reality. And I look at someone like Adam Goodes and I think he's a guy who's been Australian of the Year, who has a plug for Indigenous studies, transformed himself through, doing a bachelor's degree and majoring in Indigenous studies. Real leadership on the field around racism, leadership off the field around that through various campaigns he's been involved with. He's not even part of the whole AFL team at the moment. If you want to get him back into the AFL, make him Chief Executive Officer of the league. That's what I would say.
I would love to see him as the next CEO. I think he has so much wisdom, lived experience, and I think he would really make the whole community probably take notice of what he has to say through what he's been through.
Yep, absolutely. And yeah, he's really, like many of our leaders, is a very polished diplomat and is able to, in my view, speak in ways that encourage people to overcome their differences. And I think he could be a real unifying force and grow the game through making it really a game of diversity.
Absolutely. I think it's something we should try and do, encourage and have a movement, because someone like him, I feel what he says and I feel his words that come from his heart.
Yeah, they do. And, he's done so many things in life. I think if someone like him, if he wasn't Aboriginal and if he wasn't so strident about defending Indigenous identity and cultural positions, he'd potentially be, anything he wanted to be, including Australian Prime Minister.
I would love to see that. And now let's go forward a bit, your journey into education, academia. What set you to that pathway that led you to CDU?
Okay, well, a few things, I guess. I think I finished high school in the middle of one of the worst economic recessions that Australia has had for some time. So there were not a lot of job opportunities around at the time. I left high school. I was unemployed for a couple of months. Got really bored being on the dole. Needed to do something. So I got a job just in retail, selling stuff. And after about 6 months of that, I knew that there must be more to life than this. So I applied to what was then the Ballarat College of Advanced Education, which is now Federation University. And I applied through their community access program to do an arts degree, got in. At that time of your life, you're not really thinking about things long term. But in third year, I think I was doing a sociology subject, and there was a long assignment, 4,000 or 5,000 words end of semester assignment that I had to throw together, or maybe it was longer, maybe it was 10,000. And we had to go and have consultations with the lecturer, and she said, "You're Indigenous, aren't you? Maybe you could delve into what that means through this assignment." And I said, "Okay, that sounds like a good idea." And that really made me think about and realise what a great tool tertiary education could be into, I guess, learning about oneself, and it's a bit of, I guess it's a form of therapy and self-care. Some people drink, some people get into drugs, some of us get into higher education and, start collecting degrees and becoming intellectuals in that way. So, yeah, for me, it was a journey of self-discovery, about making sense of identity, indigeneity, race relations, politics, all of those things. And it led to, a graduate diploma, a master's, a PhD, and the themes more or less stayed the same. It was always about, Indigenous issues in one way or the other, because it reflected who I was. So for the first 10 years of my working life, I was a professional staff member in higher ed at Melbourne Uni and then Swinburne. And then in the late 90s, I crossed over to the dark side and became an academic. And I worked at the Centre for Australian Indigenous Education at Monash for about 11 years. Mm-hmm. So I lectured while getting my PhD. 2011, I left and worked at RMIT for a number of years. And then from RMIT, I went to Charles Darwin University. I went to Charles Darwin to work in Alice Springs because when I first started at RMIT, I commenced a relationship with a couple of men from Pitjantjatjara, which is a remote community in Central Australia, famous for its art movement. Mm-hmm. And so that relationship was again around Aussie rules football, and I just thought it'd be easier to work from Central Australia on that project. So that's how I ended up there. And obviously that was great because my Indigenous affiliations are with people in Central Australia. So I was moving to my home community, kind of. So yeah, that's that part of the journey. And I've come back to Melbourne now because Melbourne, the University of Melbourne, holds some significance for me as my first employer and the place where I got a master's degree. And I came back because I wanted the opportunity to play a role in renewing the Indigenous Studies program and also contributing to the great research that goes on at this university around Indigenous knowledge, people, issues, etc.
And what would you like to say to Indigenous students who are listening right now, who are perhaps contemplating what can they do once they complete, say, an arts degree or something? Yep. Where would you say, what advice would you give?
This is a reflection on my own experience rather than anybody else's abilities, but ability is important to a degree, but overriding that is a commitment and a will to succeed in whatever you do. And I think education's the same. So if you're just 100% committed to achieving whatever it is you're doing, whether it's undergraduate level studies or postgraduate level studies, you'll succeed. And a lot of it is, the hard graft, the grind of it. It's not being particularly intelligent or having great, unique insights into life, but I'm going to do a PhD. I'm going to get up every day and try and write 500 words, whether they're great words or not. I'm going to put my thoughts down on paper and I'm going to build towards the 80,000 words I need as a thesis. It's doing that hard graft that students need to focus on. It's all the boring crap, basically, Ricky. You know, in cricket they say catchers win matches, not great batting or bowling. So it's kind of the same in education. You just got to do the basics and do them well, and have a commitment to do that work. And I think it's also useful for people not to focus on the now, but to have a long-term plan. And those 250 words are going to build to 80,000 over a 3-year period. In 5 years, I'm going to be a postdoc, or I'm going to be, holding some important position in a community organisation or a government department. You've got to have those long-term goals, but you've got to also think about today and the next hour or the next 7 hours. What am I going to do? My experience of HDR students, particularly going back into the 90s when things were much freer and looser around completion rates, is that back then it wasn't uncommon to find students, mostly non-Indigenous back in that time period, who would get to the final year of their PhD and not have one word down on paper. And so, my advice is work hard, do something every day, do all the boring, mundane stuff very well, and have a long-term plan. The other thing that I think I could advise people is do things that you love. Don't make this a job, or don't make this about earning, whatever it is you want to earn in the future. Never make things about money. If you make it about those things, it's not going to fly. You've got to be in this for the love of it.
And just before we leave you, Barry, I just want to quickly reflect back. And if you could tell that little boy in grade 3 who was sent out of the room that time for speaking truths, what would you say to him right now, if you could?
I guess I'd say something like, keep the faith. You're right. And I think a message for all students is keep the faith in the things that you believe, and that's particularly important for Indigenous students, that they continue to draw strength from their own families, their own elders, their own communities, and each other.
Professor Barry Judd, it's been an absolute pleasure. Thank you so much for sharing your voice, and hopefully some young people, older people, mature age people from our communities may find some forms of words of wisdom to inspire them to come and study. And please do consider studying at University of Melbourne. There's many of us that will love to support you. Thank you.
Thank you.